In medicine, there's an old saying that it's not the fall that kills you, but the sudden stop at the end. However, in economics, death rarely comes suddenly. Economic collapse is a slow, agonizing process, like a lingering disease or a tire slowly deflating on a vehicle racing at 100 miles per hour. You don't notice the air escaping until the steering wheel begins to shake, until you attempt to turn and realize you've lost all control. This is the chronicle of the British economy, not a tale of sudden detonation, but one of gradual asphyxiation. It's the account of how a nation that once served as the world's workshop and global banker chose to tear down its own foundations. This is the Brexit story, though not the political narrative. The speeches, slogans, and buses painted with falsehoods hold no interest here. What matters is the money, the unforgiving numbers that care nothing for patriotism or sovereignty. To comprehend why Brexit became the final nail in the coffin, we must understand the patient was already gravely ill. The United Kingdom wasn't a healthy athlete when it leaped off the cliff in 2016. It was a recovering invalid. We must return to 2008, the great financial crisis. Before that year, Britain felt prosperous and invincible. The city of London reigned as the financial capital of the world. It was a golden age where credit flowed freely, house prices climbed annually, and government coffers overflowed. But this was an illusion. The British economy had become dangerously imbalanced, abandoning manufacturing for speculation, replacing factories with trading floors. When the American housing market collapsed in 2008, a tsunami crossed the Atlantic and struck London harder than almost anywhere else. The British banking system effectively collapsed. The government spent billions of taxpayer pounds rescuing institutions like Royal Bank of Scotland and Lloyds. Beyond humiliation, the deeper damage was to British productivity. Productivity, though a mundane term, is the only metric that truly matters. It measures how much value a worker generates per hour. When productivity rises, wages follow. When productivity climbs, nations grow wealthier. For decades, British productivity grew at roughly 2% annually, guaranteeing a brighter future. After 2008, it flatlined. While America, Germany, and France slowly recovered and regained efficiency, Britain stalled. Workers labored just as hard, but produced no additional value. Economists scratched their heads at this productivity puzzle, unable to comprehend why the British engine had seized. When the Conservative government assumed power in 2010, they inherited a broken machine. Their solution was austerity, cutting government spending to the bone. They slashed investment in roads, schools, and the very infrastructure that drives economic growth, believing private sector spending would compensate for government cuts. They were mistaken. The private sector remained terrified. Business investment stayed depressed, and the recovery became the slowest in recorded history. For ordinary citizens, wages stopped growing. For the first time since the Napoleonic Wars, British workers faced a decade where real pay packets shrank. This is crucial context. By 2016, the British public seethed with anger and exhaustion. They had endured 8 years of cuts, watched libraries close and hospitals struggle, seen bankers who caused the crash receive bonuses while nurses endured pay freezes. The nation was a powder keg filled with explosive resentment, needing only a spark. That spark came from David Cameron, a prime minister who believed himself lucky. He had won unexpected elections and a Scottish independence referendum. He was a gambler who had never lost, but his political party was tearing itself apart over Europe. A faction despised the European Union obsessively, while a new party called UKIP stole his voters. David Cameron decided to gamble everything by holding a referendum on whether Britain should leave the European Union. He didn't do this believing it beneficial for the economy. Every Treasury official, bank, and economist warned of disaster. He did it to save his position, to silence critics within his party. His arrogance convinced him the British people would never vote for economic suicide. He was wrong. On the 23rd of June, 2016, the British people went to the polls. The campaign had been vicious. The Leave campaign plastered buses with promises that leaving the EU would free £350 million weekly for the National Health Service. It was a beautiful lie, telling people their poverty stemmed not from banking crises or government austerity, but from Europe. It promised that severing ties would restore prosperity. The Remain campaign tried presenting numbers, warning about trade tariffs and supply chains. But feelings cannot be defeated with spreadsheets. Dreams cannot be conquered with warnings. As polls closed at 10 o'clock, financial markets remained calm. Traders bet on a Remain victory. The pound traded strong at $1.50. Then results began arriving. The first alarming sign came from Sunderland, a working-class northern city housing a massive Nissan factory that exports most cars to Europe. Logic suggested Sunderland would vote Remain, but shortly after midnight, they voted Leave by a massive margin. On trading floors across London, New York, and Tokyo, screens turned red. A bloodbath erupted. Traders realized they'd bet wrong and started selling pounds in millions, then billions. The British pound's graph that night resembles a cliff edge. Within hours, it plummeted from $1.50 down to $1.32, crashing over 10%. This doesn't happen to major currencies. It happens to developing nations during coups. That night marked the beginning of the end. David Cameron resigned the next morning, walking from number 10 Downing Street humming a tune while the country burned. He left a vacuum with no plan. Leave campaign leaders had no idea how to actually execute departure. They were dogs that caught the car, uncertain what to do with it. The economy doesn't wait for politicians. It reacts instantly, and the reaction was a freeze. Uncertainty paralyzes business. When owners don't know future rules, they don't invest, build factories, or hire staff. They wait. From the vote's announcement, UK business investment flatlined. While America, Germany, France, and Canada kept growing, the British line stayed flat for years. This represents invisible cost. Factories never built, machinery never upgraded, software never purchased. Economists call this lost growth, money that vanished because confidence evaporated. The immediate impact hit wallets. When currency crashed, everything Britain imports became more expensive. Britain imports nearly half its food and fuel. Suddenly, every banana, gas tank, and piece of technology cost 10 to 15% more. Inflation rose. Real wages that had finally started climbing were hammered down again. The average British family became poorer overnight. Leave campaigners dismissed concerns, claiming the currency crash would help exporters by making British goods cheaper for foreigners. This fundamentally misunderstood the modern British economy. Britain doesn't just dig coal and sell it. It manufactures complex products like cars, jet engines, and pharmaceuticals. To make these, Britain imports components: steel, electronics, chemicals. While a weak pound cheapened final products, it drastically increased raw material costs. Benefits canceled out. No export boom materialized, only inflation. For 4 years, Britain remained trapped in political nightmare. The government attempted negotiating with the European Union, but it proved impossible. Brexiteers wanted everything: full market access without freedom of movement or following European laws. The European Union refused, stating you cannot leave the club, stop paying fees, but still use facilities. The British government paralyzed. Prime Minister Theresa May sought compromise. She was serious, understanding that hard breaks would destroy the economy, but extremists in her party held her hostage, calling her a traitor. Every deal attempt failed parliamentary votes. Uncertainty worsened. Companies like Honda, Ford, and Airbus issued warnings about just-in-time supply chains breaking if border delays occurred. Honda eventually announced closing its massive Swindon factory. Thousands of jobs lost. In 2019, chaos became unbearable. Theresa May was forced out, replaced by Boris Johnson, the man who drove the red bus. A showman unconcerned with details, he promised to get Brexit done and won massive election victory on that slogan. People exhausted by arguing wanted it over, regardless of terms. Boris Johnson signed a terrible deal erecting massive trade barriers between Britain and its biggest trading partner. On December 31, 2020, Britain officially left the European Single Market and Customs Union. The next morning, reality hit. Not with a bang, but with silence. Trucks not moving. Small businesses died first. Imagine a Cheshire company making artisanal cheese. Before Brexit, a pallet could travel to Paris as easily as London without paperwork or checks. Suddenly, customs declarations, veterinary certificates, and agent fees were required. Sending that pallet jumped from 50 to 200 pounds, time from 1 day to 5. Extra costs eliminated profit, delays spoiled products. Thousands of small British exporters simply stopped selling to Europe. British trade with the EU collapsed by 15% initially. While the world experienced pandemic recovery trade booms, Britain suffered slumps. The Office for Budget Responsibility calculated Brexit would reduce the economy by 4%. 4% of GDP equals £100 billion annually, more than the entire education budget. Money simply vanished. Uncollected taxes, unfixed roads, unhired nurses. Then came labor shortages. Brexit promised immigration control. The government ended freedom of movement for Polish plumbers, Spanish nurses, Romanian fruit pickers. Farmers realized they relied on seasonal European workers to pick strawberries and daffodils. British workers didn't want those hard, dirty, minimum wage jobs. Without European workers, crops rotted in fields. Images showed farmers plowing thousands of pounds worth of vegetables into mud. Hospitality was hit next. London restaurants and hotels relied heavily on European staff. Suddenly unable to find waiters or chefs, they cut opening hours. The most dangerous shortage was truck drivers. Britain relied on Eastern European drivers. When they left, no one remained to drive petrol tankers. In autumn 2021, Britain faced fuel crisis not from shortage, but from no drivers to transport it from refineries to stations. People fought on forecourts. Old ladies filled water bottles with gasoline. Scenes from a failed state. This labor shortage drove inflation. Unable to find truck drivers, wages had to rise. Higher driver pay meant higher goods prices. This wage price spiral, when not driven by productivity, causes bad inflation. By 2022, Britain was trapped. Low growth from investment freeze, high inflation from weak pound and labor shortage, falling trade from new borders. Economists call this stagflation, the worst possible scenario. The final humiliation arrived autumn 2022 with Prime Minister Liz Truss. Before that catastrophe, we must examine London's crown jewel. For centuries, London served as banker to the world, the engine subsidizing the rest of the UK. Tax revenue from London banks funded Liverpool hospitals and Glasgow schools. Much success stemmed from passporting rights, allowing London banks to serve Frankfurt or Milan clients without separate offices, making London the European gateway for American and Japanese banks. Brexit destroyed passporting rights overnight. London banks lost automatic rights to serve European clients. Brexiteers claimed London was strong enough that bankers would never leave for Frankfurt. In a way, they were right. Bankers didn't want to live in Frankfurt. But money didn't care about lifestyle. It cared about regulation. The European Union demanded euro-denominated trades be cleared inside the EU, forcing clearinghouses to move. Slowly, quietly, assets began migrating. JP Morgan moved billions from London to Frankfurt. Barclays shifted business to Dublin. Not sudden exodus, but slow drain. 1,000 jobs here, $1 billion there. Amsterdam overtook London as Europe's biggest share trading center. Paris attracted high-flying hedge funds. The city of London, still huge, was no longer undisputed king. It was shrinking, and tax revenue shrank with it. This triggered psychological change. Before Brexit, Britain was seen as a safe haven by international investors. Boring, stable, ruled by law with sensible institutions. After Brexit, Britain began resembling an emerging market, volatile, unpredictable, with 4 prime ministers in 6 years, tearing up treaties, threatening trade wars. Investors started charging a Brexit premium, demanding higher returns to lend money to the British government because risk had increased. This leads to September 2022. Boris Johnson had been forced out by scandals. Conservative Party members elected Liz Truss, a true believer convinced Brexit hadn't been hard enough. She believed taxes and regulations held back the British economy. She wanted to transform Britain into Singapore-on-Thames, a low-tax, low-regulation tiger economy. She launched a mini-budget announcing the biggest tax cuts in 50 years for the rich and corporations. But she didn't explain how to pay for it. She effectively declared she would borrow billions to give to the wealthy, hoping magical growth would appear. She fired the top Treasury official, sidelined independent forecasters, declared war on economic orthodoxy. Markets listened, then destroyed her. Reaction was instantaneous and violent. Bond vigilantes woke up. Investors buying government debt saw a government losing its mind. A country with high inflation, massive debt, and shrinking economy deciding to borrow more for unaffordable tax cuts. They stopped buying UK government bonds, went on strike. When nobody buys bonds, prices crash, and interest rate yields skyrocket. Most British pension funds use liability-driven investment strategies relying on stable government bonds. When bond prices crashed so rapidly, these funds faced margin calls, needed immediate cash to cover positions. They didn't have it, had to sell assets, driving prices further down. A doom loop. The Wednesday morning after the mini-budget, the Bank of England received a terrifying call. Pension funds were hours from insolvency. If the bank didn't intervene, millions would lose retirement savings that afternoon. The Bank of England had to print £65 billion to buy junk bonds Liz Truss created, bailing out the country from its own prime minister. The pound crashed to historic lows, nearly reaching parity with the dollar. Liz Truss lasted 44 days, becoming the shortest-serving prime minister in British history, famously outlasted by a lettuce. A newspaper live-streamed to see which would rot first. Damage was done. Risk premium was baked into the British economy. Everyone's mortgage rates climbed because government borrowing costs increased. Banks charged more to lend. Millions saw monthly payments jump by hundreds of pounds. This was the Truss tax. The price of incompetence? Really, the price of Brexit. After Truss, Rishi Sunak took over, a sensible accountant whose job was managing decline. He raised taxes, cut spending, tried calming markets, essentially doing what the IMF tells bankrupt countries to do. That's where we stand today. The UK has become Europe's sick man again. Since the referendum, UK economic growth has significantly lagged behind the US and Eurozone, the gap widening yearly. The average British household is thousands of pounds poorer than if the vote had gone differently. Public services crumble from lack of tax revenue. The NHS has waiting lists of 7 million people. Schools literally collapse from crumbling concrete with no money for repairs. Police stopped investigating burglaries. This is what economic failure feels like. Not Hollywood, not Mad Max. 12-hour emergency room waits. 3-week waits for doctor appointments. Hitting potholes driving to work. Paying £6 for butter. Gray, slow decay. The tragedy is, it was all self-inflicted. No war, no earthquake, no plague caused this. It was a choice. The British people were told they could reclaim past glory. Instead, they mortgaged their future, voting to pull up the drawbridge only to realize too late they'd locked themselves in the dungeon. The collapse of the pound was the scorecard, the world telling Britain its new worth. The answer is less. Britain is now poorer, more isolated, with dirtier rivers and crumbling schools, where police don't respond and ambulances take 3 hours. It's a country running down, the public realm exhausted, streets shabbier, shops closing. Only now, in 2025, is the silence breaking. Polls show massive majorities now think Brexit was a mistake. Even Leave voters are changing minds, looking at bills, empty shelves, and saying this isn't what they voted for. They were promised a Ferrari, sold a broken bicycle. There's no quick fix, no undo button. Rejoining the EU would take years, and the EU might not want Britain back after proving itself unreliable and unstable. Britain faces a long, hard road, a decade of stagnation, slowly, painfully rebuilding relationships with Europe, following European rules without voice in making them, becoming a rule taker, not rule maker, ultimate humiliation for sovereignty campaigners. Brexit serves as a warning to the world that democracy is fragile, lies have consequences, economics cannot be separated from politics. Building politics on anger, nostalgia, and rejection of expert advice eventually crashes economies. Markets don't care about flags or past glory. Markets care about stability and reality. Britain chose fantasy over reality. Now the bill has come due. The last bullet was fired in 2016, but the patient still bleeds. The collapse of the pound wasn't just currency fluctuation. It was the heartbeat of an empire finally stopping. History books will look back with bewilderment, asking why a wealthy, successful nation chose to impose sanctions on itself, how a population was persuaded to vote for its own impoverishment. The answer will be a red bus, a lie, and a tragic misunderstanding of what makes countries strong in the 21st century. Strength is not standing alone, but standing together. Britain forgot that lesson and pays the price every single day.